The platform at Bordeaux station holds 130 people in the pre-dawn darkness of July 18, 1944. They stand in loose groups, guarded by German soldiers whose uniforms show the dust of hasty mobilization. These prisoners are members of the French resistance, political detainees, Jews arrested in recent sweeps, and ordinary citizens caught in the machinery of occupation justice. They have come from Fort WWII, the medieval fortress converted into a Gestapo prison, where interrogations left marks that still show on faces and bodies. Some prisoners carry small bundles of possessions. Others have nothing but the clothes they wore when arrested. The youngest is 15. The oldest is 73. They do not yet know they are about to board a train that will take 3 weeks to travel a distance normally covered in 3 days. The freight cars waiting at the platform are wooden, built for transporting livestock or cargo, not human beings. Each car measures approximately 4 meters wide and 8 meters long. The Germans intend to load 50 people into each car, a density that leaves almost no room to sit or lie down. There are no windows, only small ventilation slits near the roof. The doors will be sealed from outside with heavy iron bars. A single bucket in each car serves as toilet. Another bucket contains water, though the amount is insufficient for 50 people even for a single day. The prisoners are ordered into the cars with shouts and the threat of rifle butts. Families try to stay together. Strangers press against each other as the space fills beyond capacity. When the doors slide shut and the bars clang into place, the darkness inside becomes absolute except for thin lines of light from the ventilation slits. The train does not leave immediately. It sits on the siding for hours while German rail officials argue about routing and priority. The sun rises and the temperature inside the sealed cars begins to climb. By mid-morning, the heat is becoming unbearable. People remove jackets and loosen clothing. They take turns standing near the ventilation slits, trying to catch airflow. The single water bucket is rationed carefully because no one knows when it will be refilled. Some prisoners try to organize the space, designating corners for different purposes, but the overcrowding makes any system difficult. Bodies touch constantly. There is no privacy, no escape from the press of other humans in the dark heat. When the train finally begins moving in late afternoon, lurching forward with the grinding of wheels on track, there is momentary relief among the prisoners. Movement means progress toward whatever destination awaits. It means this journey has a purpose and an end. But the train moves slowly, stopping frequently for reasons that remain mysterious to those locked inside the cars. Sometimes it sits motionless for hours on sidings while other trains pass. The prisoners learn to distinguish between the sounds of movement and stillness, to recognize when the engine is idling versus when it has been shut down completely. Time becomes measured not in hours but in the intervals between stops, between the moments when guards might open the doors to remove the dead or to provide water. The route from Bordeaux should lead northeast toward Germany through occupied France. But Allied forces have landed in Normandy 6 weeks earlier and are pushing inland. The French resistance has intensified sabotage operations against rail lines. German forces are attempting to withdraw troops and equipment from southwestern France, while simultaneously moving prisoners eastward before the advancing Allies can liberate them. The result is chaos on the rail network. Tracks are damaged by sabotage. Bridges are destroyed by airstrikes. Trains compete for available routes. The ghost train carrying its human cargo becomes trapped in this disintegrating system, moving a few kilometers then stopping for days, diverted onto side tracks, forgotten while more militarily important transports are prioritized. Inside the cars, the initial discipline and organization begin to break down as days pass without adequate food or water. The single bucket of water empties quickly in the heat. When guards finally open the doors at a stop, they sometimes refill the buckets but often do not. The prisoners begin to understand that their survival is not a priority for their captors, that this journey is designed less to transport them efficiently than to ensure they do not fall into Allied hands alive. People grow weak from thirst and hunger. The bucket designated as toilet overflows, creating sanitary conditions that accelerate illness. Dysentery spreads through the cars. Those who become sick have nowhere to isolate themselves, no way to avoid contaminating others in the confined space. An older man in one of the cars begins to recite poetry in the darkness. He speaks the words of Victor Hugo and Charles Baudelaire, verses about freedom and beauty that seem impossibly distant from the reality of their situation. Others join in when they know the poems, their voices creating a chorus that momentarily transcends the physical misery. The recitations become a ritual, something to mark time and maintain human connection. When someone finishes a poem, another begins a different one, and the chain continues until exhaustion or thirst makes speech impossible. The guards outside the cars can hear the voices but cannot understand why these people persist in such futile gestures. They do not realize that the poetry is a form of resistance, a refusal to be reduced entirely to suffering bodies. The train reaches Angoulême after 3 days, having covered barely 100 kilometers. It sits in the rail yard for 2 days while German officials argue about whether to continue east or to divert south. During this stop, the doors are opened for the first time since Bordeaux. Guards order the prisoners out in groups to be counted and to receive water. The sunlight is blinding after days in darkness. People stumble as they step down from the cars, their legs stiff from immobility. Some prisoners have died in the cars, and their bodies are removed and left on the platform. The survivors look at the corpses with the numb recognition that this could be any of them, that survival is becoming random rather than determined by strength or will. Red Cross workers manage to reach the train during the Angoulême stop, bringing water, bread, and basic medical supplies. They move along the platform distributing what little they have, trying to assist the weakest prisoners. The German guards tolerate this intervention briefly but then order the Red Cross away, shouting that these are criminals and terrorists who deserve no humanitarian consideration. The Red Cross workers leave packages of supplies on the platform, and prisoners grab what they can before being forced back into the cars. The doors seal again. The bars clang shut. The darkness returns. But the brief contact with the outside world, the recognition that someone beyond their captors knows they exist, provides psychological sustenance that helps some prisoners endure the next phase of the journey. The train moves east again, making slow progress through the French countryside where wheat fields stretch golden under August sun. Inside the cars, the temperature climbs above 40 degrees Celsius. People remove all clothing that modesty permits. They try to create fans from scraps of paper or cloth, waving them uselessly in the still air. Those positioned near the ventilation slits describe what they can see outside: the landscape, the sky, the occasional glimpse of villages or farms. These descriptions become precious, allowing others to imagine space beyond the walls that contain them. A young woman in one car has a birthday during the journey. She is 23. Her companions sing quietly in celebration, a song that has been sung at French birthdays for generations. The normalcy of this gesture in such circumstances creates both comfort and anguish. Near Limoges, the train stops on a siding and remains motionless for 4 days. The reason for the delay is never explained to the prisoners. They can hear other trains passing on adjacent tracks, hear the sounds of a rail yard in operation, hear German soldiers shouting orders. But their train does not move. The water runs out on the 2nd day of this stop. Prisoners begin drinking their own urine, a desperate measure that provides no real hydration but creates the psychological relief of consuming liquid. Some people lick the condensation that forms on the metal walls in early morning. Others try to catch rain through the ventilation slits, but August in central France is dry and rain does not come. The suffering intensifies beyond what had seemed like the limits of endurance. People who had remained strong begin to weaken. Those who were already weak begin to die. A resistance fighter in one of the cars manages to work loose a board in the wall, creating a gap slightly larger than the ventilation slits. The work takes hours and requires absolute silence to avoid alerting guards. When the board finally comes free, the opening provides additional ventilation and allows prisoners to see more of the outside. They take turns looking through the gap, describing what they see to others. The view shows only the rail yard, other freight cars, German soldiers moving in the distance. But the ability to see out, to have some connection to the world beyond the car, provides psychological relief disproportionate to the physical benefit of the extra airflow. The prisoners carefully replace the board when guards approach, then remove it again when the danger passes. The train finally moves again, continuing east through France as August advances. Allied forces are closing in from multiple directions. The German rail system is collapsing under combined pressure of military retreat, resistant sabotage, and Allied bombing. The ghost train becomes trapped in this deteriorating situation, sometimes moving only a few kilometers before being forced to stop and wait while rails are repaired or while higher priority military trains pass. The journey that should have taken days stretches into weeks. Prisoners lose track of dates. They mark time by counting the number of times the doors have been opened, the number of stops where water was provided versus stops where nothing came. In one car, a former teacher organizes lessons for the younger prisoners. She teaches mathematics by proposing problems that can be solved mentally. She teaches geography by describing the route they might be traveling, naming cities and rivers and explaining the landscape. She teaches history by recounting stories of French resistance to previous occupations. The lessons provide mental occupation that helps combat the psychological deterioration caused by prolonged confinement and suffering. Other adults in the car support this effort, contributing their own knowledge and creating a makeshift school in the darkness. When someone becomes too weak to participate, others continue the lessons around them, maintaining the ritual even as its participants diminish. The train crosses into Germany in late August, more than a month after leaving Bordeaux. The landscape visible through the ventilation slits changes, and prisoners who know German can hear the different language spoken by workers at rail yards. The realization that they have reached Germany creates new fear. They are now deep in enemy territory, far from any possibility of rescue or liberation. Whatever happens next will occur in places where no French authorities can intervene, where no witnesses will document their fate. Some prisoners respond to this realization with despair, falling silent and withdrawing into themselves. Others respond with renewed determination to survive, reasoning that having endured this much, giving up now would waste everything they have already suffered. At one stop, guards distribute postcards and pencils, ordering prisoners to write messages home indicating they are well and being treated properly. The cards will be confiscated, censored, and possibly never sent, but prisoners write them anyway because the act of composing words to loved ones provides connection to lives that feel increasingly distant. A man writes to his wife describing ordinary details of their life together, avoiding any mention of his current situation because the censors will not allow such information. A mother writes to her children telling them to be brave and to remember that she loves them. A young man writes to his parents apologizing for joining the resistance, though he does not regret the choice itself. These messages, some of which eventually reach their destinations months or years later, become the last words some prisoners ever communicate to their families. The train arrives at Dachau concentration camp in early September 1944, approximately 7 weeks after leaving Bordeaux. The journey that should have covered roughly 800 kilometers in a single day has taken 48 days, winding through France and Germany on a route dictated by military chaos rather than geographic logic. When the doors finally open and prisoners are ordered out, many cannot walk. They have been confined in darkness and overcrowding for weeks, with minimal food and water, breathing air thick with disease and human waste. They stumble down from the cars, blinking in sunlight, barely recognizable as the people who boarded in Bordeaux. Some prisoners remain in the cars, too weak to move or already dead. Guards pull these bodies out, piling them on the platform to be disposed of later. Of the approximately 540 people who boarded the train in Bordeaux, fewer than 400 survive to reach Dachau. The dead include those who succumb to thirst, hunger, disease, and the accumulated effects of prolonged suffering in conditions designed to kill through neglect. Their bodies were removed at various stops along the route and buried in unmarked graves, or left on platforms to be disposed of by local authorities. Their names were not always recorded. Their families often learned nothing of their fate for years, if ever. The ghost train that carried them disappeared into the chaos of war's end, its journey documented incompletely in scattered records and the memories of survivors who would spend the rest of their lives trying to make sense of what they endured. The survivors who reach Dachau face additional months of imprisonment in the concentration camp system. They work in labor details, survive on starvation rations, and watch as others die around them from disease, exhaustion, and execution. The experience of the train journey becomes one trauma layered upon others, a particular kind of suffering that survivors will later struggle to describe because its horror was less in singular moments of terror than in the accumulation of days without hope, without knowledge of whether the journey would ever end, without anything to do but endure. Some survivors will say later that the train was worse than the camp because at least in the camp they could move, could see sky, could have some sense of their situation. The train was sealed darkness, human bodies pressed together, time suspended in suffering that seemed to have no purpose beyond suffering itself. When Allied forces liberate Dachau in April 1945, 8 months after the train's arrival, they find survivors of many nationalities and many transports. The French prisoners who came on the ghost train are among them, though their numbers have decreased through death and transfer to other camps. They emerge from the gate skeletal, diseased, barely alive. They are processed through Allied military medical facilities, gradually nursed back to physical health, though the psychological damage will never fully heal. They make their way back to France in groups, some arriving in early summer 1945, others not returning until autumn or winter. They come back to a country that has been liberated but has not yet fully reckoned with what happened during the occupation years. The survivors begin telling their stories to families, to military officials conducting post-war investigations, to journalists documenting the French experience of deportation. The account of the ghost train emerges piecemeal as different survivors describe their experiences, and officials attempt to piece together the route and timeline. Records from the German rail system and Wehrmacht documents provide some information about the train's movements, though much has been destroyed or lost. Red Cross reports from Angoulême confirm the train's presence there and document the poor condition of prisoners even early in the journey. Testimony from survivors provides detail about conditions inside the cars and about those who died before reaching Dachau. The investigation into the train's journey reveals the extent to which the transport was a death operation as much as a prisoner transfer. The decision to seal hundreds of people in unventilated freight cars in August heat, with minimal food and water, guaranteed that many would die. The prolonged delays, during which guards failed to provide adequate supplies, accelerated the death rate. The route's continual diversions and stops, rather than simply being consequences of wartime rail chaos, reflected German military priorities that treated prisoner survival as irrelevant. The ghost train was not an aberration or an accident but represented the systematic cruelty that characterized Nazi treatment of prisoners during the war's final year, when the regime was collapsing but remained committed to transporting or killing those it had imprisoned. The French government eventually recognizes the deportees from Bordeaux as victims of Nazi persecution, providing documentation and memorial support. The survivors receive small pensions and official status as deportees, though nothing can compensate for what they lost. Some write memoirs describing their experiences. Others give testimony to historical archives. A few become involved in educational efforts, speaking to school groups about the resistance and deportation. Most try to rebuild their lives, finding work, starting families, and attempting to create normal existence despite the weight of memory they carry. A memorial is eventually erected in Bordeaux at the site where the train departed, a simple stone marker listing the names of those who were deported and noting that many died during transport or in German camps. The memorial stands near the modern station where trains continue to arrive and depart on schedules measured in hours rather than weeks, carrying passengers who travel in comfort rather than sealed in darkness. Visitors to the memorial sometimes pause to read the names, though most pass without noticing it, focused on their own journeys. The ghost train has faded from popular memory, overshadowed by larger narratives of liberation and resistance. The survivors age and die over the following decades, taking with them their direct memories of the journey. By the early 21st century, only a handful remain alive, all in their 90s or older, their voices thin but insistent when they speak about what happened in 1944. They describe the heat, the thirst, the darkness, and the way time seemed to stop inside the cars. They describe the people who died, naming them when they remember names, describing personalities and final moments. They describe the poetry recited in darkness, the birthday song, the makeshift lessons. They describe the moment when the doors finally opened at Dachau and they stumbled into sunlight, barely able to stand but alive. The last survivors emphasize that what they endured was not exceptional, that similar transports carried thousands of prisoners to camps across Europe, that their experience was repeated with variations throughout the occupied territories. They insist their story matters not because it was unique but because it was typical, because understanding what happened on one train helps illuminate what happened to so many others whose journeys were never documented or whose survivors did not live to tell. The ghost train stands as representative of all the deportation transports, all the sealed freight cars, all the journeys that transformed human beings into cargo to be moved or discarded according to the logistics of genocide and occupation. The historical record preserves what can be known about the train: departure date, approximate route, duration, death toll, names of some prisoners. But the record cannot fully capture what it meant to live through those weeks sealed in darkness, to watch people die from preventable causes, to wonder each day whether this would be the day you died, to maintain hope or lose it, to resist through poetry and song or to fall silent in despair. These interior experiences remain accessible only through testimony, through the words survivors chose to describe what happened in ways that might help others understand what cannot be fully communicated. The ghost train continues to haunt French memory of the occupation as a symbol of the deportations that affected thousands of families. It appears in literature, in historical studies, in commemorative events. It is taught in schools as part of lessons about collaboration and resistance, about the machinery of persecution, about civilian experiences of war. The story is difficult to hear because it offers little heroism or redemption, only suffering and survival. There are no dramatic escapes, no last-minute rescues, no moments when prisoners overcome their captors. There is only endurance until the doors open, and for too many, there is not even that. The letters written on postcards during the journey, the few that reach their destinations, remain in family archives or historical collections. They are brief, constrained by censorship, revealing little about actual conditions. But families treasured them as final communications from loved ones, as evidence that someone had been thinking of home even while trapped in circumstances beyond imagining. The postcards with their forced cheerfulness and mandatory assurances of proper treatment become testimony to the gap between official narrative and lived reality, between what prisoners were required to write and what they actually experienced. The route of the train can be traced on maps, the stops marked, the timeline reconstructed. The journey appears as a line wandering across France and into Germany, a geographic representation that suggests motion and progress. But this line cannot show the reality inside the cars, the time that expanded into something beyond normal duration, the space that contracted until bodies had no room to lie down. The map is accurate but incomplete, showing where without conveying what or how. The technical details of dates and distances, necessary for historical documentation, create framework but cannot contain the human experience those details describe. The ghost train of 1944 becomes, in memory and history, more than a single transport. It becomes symbol and warning, evidence of what systems of persecution do to human beings when those systems are allowed to operate without restraint or accountability. It demonstrates that death can be administered not only through direct violence but through the creation of conditions where death becomes inevitable. It shows that ordinary bureaucratic procedures, like transporting prisoners by rail, can become instruments of murder when combined with deliberate neglect and indifference to human suffering. The train reveals how logistics and ideology intersect in the machinery of atrocity. The survivors who lived long enough to see the train's story documented and memorialized express mixed feelings about the attention. Some feel the focus on their particular transport risks overshadowing the larger deportation experience affecting tens of thousands of French prisoners. Others appreciate that their survival allows them to bear witness for those who died, to ensure that the journey is not forgotten, that the names of the dead are preserved. All insist that remembering must serve purposes beyond commemoration, must inform understanding of how such things become possible and what responsibilities fall on subsequent generations to prevent repetition. The ghost train passed through the French countryside while farmers worked their fields, while villagers went about daily life, while the war's momentum shifted toward Allied victory. Most people who saw the train did not know what it carried or under what conditions. Some who did know looked away, unable or unwilling to intervene. The train's passage left no visible mark on the landscape it crossed. The rails it traveled on continued carrying other trains. The stations where it stopped resumed normal function. The fields where the dead were briefly buried grew crops again. Physical traces disappeared while memory remained, carried forward by survivors until their deaths, then transferred to documents and testimonies and memorials that ask new generations to bear witness to what they did not experience. In the end, the ghost train represents the destruction of ordinary lives by historical forces beyond individual control. The people who boarded in Bordeaux were not heroes or villains but ordinary citizens who found themselves caught in the machinery of occupation and deportation. They responded with the resources available to them: courage, solidarity, hope, resignation, despair. They died or survived based partly on circumstance, partly on physical resilience, partly on chance. Their story survives not because it offers inspiring lessons about triumph over adversity but because it demands recognition that such things happened, that real people suffered in specific ways, and that bearing witness to that suffering constitutes a moral obligation for those who come after.